So terminology, again, some of this is review, but it's important to refresh your knowledge. Secured versus unsecured. Secured is where you provide collateral that you pledge to the lender such that if you do not pay your debt, they can acquire the collateral. Classic examples for consumers would be a mortgage on your house. You don't pay your mortgage, they get your house. A car loan, when you buy a car, you don't pay your car loan, they take your car back from repossession. So that is the power of security. It provides incentive for the lender to give you a loan, and it provides you severe risk if you were to not pay the loan. And that's why it is an important distinction. Next is the line of credit. Line of credit is of varying amounts. It's a committed amount in total that you can borrow up to that amount, or if you don't need the money, pay it back. So it's highly flexible, it's very powerful, and it's a major tool for most CFOs to manage the ups and downs of their cash flow, whether that cash flow is from operations or just their working capital cycles. And this also could be secured or unsecured. You could, for example, secure your line of credit on all your receivables or all your receivables and inventory, so that if you don't make payments on a line of credit, they could contact your customers and say, hey, don't pay the company, pay us, the bank. Or they could attach your inventory, acquire it, and then sell it and liquidate it to pay back their loan. A term loan, as the name implies, has a term, a time frame. So there is a maturity date to this. Typically for corporate finance and for startups, this is for equipment loans of a certain duration. So it might be a 3-year equipment loan to buy computers. That would be an example of a term loan. Again, it could be unsecured or secured. Secured would be like that loan to buy equipment. If you don't pay, they get your equipment. Or it could be unsecured, which is harder to get, as you would imagine. Collateralized debt is just another term related to the idea of security. So collateral is something pledged that has value, that is easily or at least possibly acquired by the holder of the debt, and that is the collateral. Guarantee is dangerous stuff. Well, we talked about that in the first video. A guarantee is another legal entity that guarantees the loan of the borrower. So the borrower borrows money and as additional security to the lender has another party, could be an individual, a company, a partnership, or whoever, and says that if the borrower does not make good on the payments, the bank may look to, or the lender may look to the guarantor to get money. Senior debt refers to the order of repayment in case of a bad scenario like bankruptcy. In a case of bankruptcy, who gets money first, second, and third? This order of payment is dictated by the seniority of the debt. The more senior, the earlier you get your money. The more junior, the later you get money. So obviously, very important consideration for the risk to the lender. Bridge loan, this is what I mentioned in the first video. A bridge loan is intended to get you from here to there, from San Francisco to Oakland. And it is, so there's usually a business circumstance that causes a need for a bridge, and the bridge is usually a shorter duration and maybe a higher interest rate because the risk is higher. Prime rate, this is now more often called a reference rate, but it's still used in a prime rate terminology because of historical remnants. A prime rate is the rate that is provided to the bank's best customers, and that's the definition of it. But over time, the reference rate has more been a derived number based on the cost of capital to the bank. In the past, those were synonymous. That's why we used it that way. But nowadays, it is possible for a great customer of a bank to get funding or a loan below the reference rate for business reasons. So that's why we take away this notion of it's the rate a person or a company of a certain credit caliber would receive. It's now more accurately called a reference rate, which is derived by the bank. A bond rating, we know what that is. It's where you have a bond rating agency such as Moody's or Standard & Poor's or Fitch's examine your company, your financials, etc., in order to rate it, AAA, AA, B, junk bond, etc. And related would be the concept of factoring. Factoring is where you give something of value to a lender, and then they now own that asset and then collect the cash from that asset. Most common factoring is accounts receivable. You have a lot of people that owe you money, but you need cash. You go to a factoring bank or financial institution and you sell your receivables for cash now at a discount. So you get your cash to do what you need to do. The factoring company now owns those receivables, and you contact your customers and tell them, you know, that money you owed me, well, go pay the factoring company. So that's not a very nice thing to do because it exposes a financial weakness to your customers. And lease financing is very common for startups to acquire equipment like computers. And it's where you lease something. Again, you don't own the equipment technically. You get the right to use the equipment for a number of years based on monthly payments. Very similar to you renting an apartment to live in. You don't own the apartment, you lease the apartment, and you sign a lease for a certain amount of time and a certain amount. That's what a lease is. So when we look at equity, equity is available for all stages because it is the vehicle by which we have high risk capital. So equity could be different by source, as we said earlier. It could be you or you and your partners buying the initial stock. It could be friends and family. Your mom and dad want to help you. That's equity. And in longer term, it becomes venture capital, institutional, more serious money. Terms are very different. Your initial capital would be common stock, and over time, as you get institutional investors, they do not accept common stock typically. They want preferred stock. We'll go into all the details of why they do it and how the power of the preferred is shifted to the hands of the venture capitalists and angels. Valuation, how do you know the value? Your company is not publicly traded. So valuation is often art and science, and sometimes based on benchmarks, sometimes based on projections, but regardless, it's a very difficult thing and imprecise. Formality could be a handshake and followed by some simple filings with the Secretary of State. For a more sophisticated investor, it will be a full-blown legal document with many stock subscription provisions and protections. Form of entity, it could be individuals investing or partnerships or corporations, and these are open to you based on the nature of your entity. And power and ownership. This is the dreaded dilution for the founder. Founder starts with 100% and over successive rounds of financing gets less and less and less ownership, and at some point may become a less than majority or even become a very small minority owner in his or her own company. This is the reality of getting outside capital. So the trade-offs are reflected in the rates of return that are expected. Early, the rate might be very high, like 50%, with a range of 40 to 60 for a raw seed level startup. When we get almost to being public, it'll start approaching the return that you would get as a public company. Still, it'd be less because you don't have liquidity, don't have the rigor or the validations that a public company has, but it approaches it. So as we walk up the stairway to heaven, the required rate of return will drop, assuming you're reducing risk for your company. So summarizing chapter 7, we now see that the financial markets work, but we're at the private end, which means we don't have access or the benefits of organized markets and a lot of data. We have no markets, no organized markets, and very little data. Risk return, it varies. So now it becomes more of a judgmental aspect, similar, again, what we said, art and science. And these are assessed daily by people who are in the space, whether they're providers of equity or debt. Those who are looking at doing partnerships or even customers are doing risk return evaluations on whether to do business with your startup. And on the weighted average cost of capital, we just don't have those. We could do some machinations such as pure play or other estimations to infer things that we need for a WACC calculation. But by and large, it's not available and very, very difficult to do. All right, so that's chapter 7, and we're going to move on to chapter 8, which relates to securities and securities law.